On the first night of winter in 1984, Laura Ellington left the store on Main Street and stepped onto the snowy, icy path that led back to her dorm, the same route she took every evening. 20 minutes later, the dorm reported that Laura hadn't returned. Her room was silent, and the stretch of road between two streetlights was completely free of footprints. No purse, no cries for help, no witnesses who saw anything unusual, just her scarf lying crooked in the bushes, in a spot no one believed it could have fallen naturally. Laura's car was later found parked facing the wrong direction, the door slightly ajar, and inside was a receipt for something she never bought, suggesting someone else had been with her in those final minutes. Then, in the summer of 2025, when US 191 was being dug up for widening, workers uncovered a skeleton buried under ancient soil along with the silver bracelet Laura always wore, and secrets buried for 4 decades began to surface. But it was the Glacier Blue paint, the off-road tire marks, and the traced DNA on the inside of the bracelet that raised the biggest question of all: who was with Laura that night, and how had he managed to vanish from Montana for 40 years? Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the latest cases. The first winter night settled over Bozeman, Montana, with a strange stillness that locals always say only cold valleys have a quiet so complete, you can almost hear the snow landing on the pavement. The air was thick with frost, rolling down from the Bridger Mountains and sweeping through the empty streets, curling into gusts that whipped under old eaves. On Main Street, the lonely yellow glow from the few shops still open late reflected off the thin ice, making the pavement shimmer like warped mirrors under the dark sky. Thick clouds swallowed every bit of light, plunging the town into deep black. Laura Ellington stepped out of the small grocery store, where she'd just finished her evening shift. She pushed open the heavy glass door still fogged from the heater inside, pulled her collar up against the blast of cold that slapped her face. Her breath came out in fragile white puffs that vanished the instant they touched the air. Laura wrapped her familiar wool scarf tighter, then stepped into the freezing emptiness of the main street. She turned into the narrow walkway that led toward the dorms near South 11th Avenue, her boots leaving faint prints in the thin snow. That stretch of road now held only the wind and the sound of her footsteps. A few locals passing by caught a glimpse of Laura crossing the intersection, walking quickly to stay warm, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary to them. To them she was just the familiar sight of a college student heading back to her room after a late shift. No one knew it would be the last time they ever saw her. As Laura disappeared behind the row of buildings, the light from Main Street faded, giving way to patches of darkness between the scattered streetlights. The path to the dorms was even quieter, filled only with the wind's long sighing howl, like the town itself exhaling. Inside the dorm, the wall clock ticked steadily. Laura's roommate at first figured she'd stopped somewhere, maybe grabbed a snack, or met a friend on the way back. But then time dragged on, far longer than usual. Laura never went anywhere without saying something, especially not in weather this cold. The landline in the room started ringing as friends called to check, but only long shrill rings echoed through the empty space. No one picked up in Laura's room either. They tried the grocery store, messaged mutual friends, tried to imagine where she could be. Nobody knew anything. The initial worry quickly turned into an inexplicable dread when her roommate opened the closet and saw that the heavy coat Laura always wore on cold nights was still hanging there. That meant Laura had never made it back. Every minute felt like an hour. No one said it out loud, but the silence in the small room was enough to show something was wrong. Laura didn't just vanish like that, not Laura, and as the room sank into heavy silence, her roommate took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and called Helena, the town where Laura's family lived. The moment they heard the worry in each other's voices, they knew this was more serious than anyone wanted to believe. In that freezing moment, under Montana's pitch-black night, Laura's family made the call no one ever wants to make. They had to contact the police. When Laura's family reported her missing, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office treated it with higher priority than usual, partly because the freezing weather could be deadly for anyone stuck outside, and partly because missing person cases in Bozeman, especially college students, were so rare that everyone was considered abnormal. Within less than an hour, 2 patrol cars were dispatched from near the university to Main Street, where Laura had last been seen leaving the store. The officers stepped out into the biting cold, their breath fogging just like Laura's had the night before, creating an eerie feeling as they began walking the same route she'd taken. Their first step was to reconstruct Laura's walk based on statements from the coworker who'd been on shift with her that night. The coworker pointed out exactly how Laura had said goodbye, wrapped in her scarf, as she stepped into the street, then disappeared into the darkness across the road. They described her as looking not worried or rushed, just a young woman walking home, after a long day of classes and work. From that point, police followed the exact route Laura always took on foot to the dorms. The side path next to the store was so narrow that 2 people walking toward each other would struggle to pass. The sparse streetlights left most of the walkway in shadow. Wind-swept snow created a bumpy surface, and the unleered sidewalks looked like endless rough white patches. The officers examined every tiny detail, the placement of lampposts, the dark gaps between pools of light, the hidden corners where a stranger could wait unseen. Those danger spots were more numerous than they'd expected. The map of Laura's route ended up dotted with tiny red circles, each marking a possible approach point. As they neared the residential area where a few old houses overlooked the path Laura had to take, they knocked on doors of anyone still awake. A middle-aged woman, wrapped in a thick robe, cracked her door just enough to talk and said she thought she'd seen a young woman cross the corner that evening, but it was too dark to be sure. She only remembered a fleeting silhouette, small frame, long scarf, hurrying through the cold wind. When police asked if she'd seen anyone following or any strange vehicles, she shook her head, saying that after that figure, the street behind was just darkness that swallowed everything. Her statement wasn't definitive, but it added to the unease of the officers standing in the bone-chilling cold. They kept moving along the route, marking spots where they believed Laura could have been approached, a dimly lit dead-end stretch, a small intersection with no visibility, a thick row of trees forming a black wall along the curb. There was nothing that qualified as clear evidence, but the way the shadows lay like natural traps made the officers pause longer than planned. They looked down at the snow and saw a few faint skid marks. Could be footprints, could just be wind dragging the snow into meaningless curves. Yet that very ambiguity made them more alert. From small things, a corner too dark, a patch of snow lightly disturbed, a wooden sign rattling softly in the wind, the atmosphere began to fill with dread, the kind any seasoned investigator knows can be just as important as physical proof. One officer wrote in his notebook, "This route allows for a quick silent approach with no witnesses." The other marked 3 high-risk spots. Neither said it out loud, but both felt the same thing. Laura hadn't disappeared for no reason, and the path she took that night was the perfect place for someone with bad intentions to strike unnoticed. The Bozeman night grew colder and darker as it wore on, as if swallowing every trace, but for the Gallatin County Police, the investigation had officially begun, starting in the very shadows Laura Ellington had walked through and never returned from. The darkness in Bozeman thickened past midnight, but instead of slowing, activity along the route Laura had walked grew more intense. As more officers were called in, Gallatin County Police coordinated with volunteer search teams from the university area. People familiar with the terrain and often brought in for winter emergencies, they carried powerful flashlights, moving in small groups along sidewalks, curbs, and the rows of houses connecting Main Street to the dorms. Beams of light swept across old brick walls, roadside trees, and the dark patches Laura had walked through just hours earlier. The snow crunched softly under their boots, the only sound breaking the compressed silence of a Montana night. One young officer returned to the house where the middle-aged woman had described seeing Laura's silhouette. When pressed for more detail, she recalled hearing, somewhere in the distance, a sound like a car accelerating, but it was very brief, like someone floored it suddenly, then shut off or turned onto another street. Police logged it without dismissing it, because almost no one drove that stretch at that hour, especially in such cold. 2 officers followed the direction she indicated, shining flashlights over the pavement, fences, and faint snow tracks. Before long, they found a patch of snow with unnatural tread marks, a faint arc, not clear but looking like someone had been spun around or shoved off course. Wind had blown over it several times, blurring the edges, but the distortion was unlike normal walking steps. One officer crouched, slipping a hand under the thin snow to feel the surface below. As he suspected, the snow here had been smeared sideways, not in the direction of someone walking straight. They marked the area with temporary reflective tape. As the search team moved deeper into the dark stretch, they noticed a small area beside a low row of houses. It was a true dead zone for light, 2 streetlights too far apart, creating a shadow more than 3 meters long, enough for someone to stand motionless and remain unseen from either end. The team lingered there a long time because it sat directly on Laura's route, and the layout allowed for a fast, silent approach. One searcher knelt, shining his light flat against the ground. He spotted a series of very shallow, uneven depressions running sideways across the path. Not clear enough to identify as footprints or drag marks, but they led toward a side road Laura never used to get home. When he aimed the light at the nearby brick wall, he saw patches of snow that had fallen, as if someone had brushed against it or used it for leverage. Those small details, on their own meaningless together, created a distinct sense of something wrong. Each could be random, but placed along Laura's route, they started painting a faint picture of what might have happened. Another search group, near a small intersection by an empty lot, radioed that they'd found larger arc-shaped tread marks in the snow, as if someone had turned sharply or resisted a strong pull. One officer recalled the neighbor's statement about the accelerating car. If Laura had been approached in that dark spot and shoved or dragged off course, a waiting idling vehicle could have been parked just off the road. Door closed and gone in seconds before anyone registered the sound. The thought made the air along the route feel heavier. On the snow, flashlight beams swept over strange curves, vague enough to be inconclusive, but enough for experienced investigators to sense that someone had stood here, waited for the right moment, chosen the perfect spot. Standing in that quiet darkness, holding their breath so the wind wouldn't mask any sound, unease spread through the group. This was no longer a case of a student getting lost or passing out from cold. This was where an approach had happened, and probably where Laura Ellington vanished from the path she walked every day. The search team pushed deeper into the dark stretch where the suspicious tread marks appeared, and when they swept their flashlights to the right, along the curb leading into a low grassy area, a beam caught a small object lying well off into the bushes. At first, it was just a darker patch against the snow and dead grass, but when an officer stepped closer and gently pushed aside the broken stalks, the familiar deep red appeared like a painful streak in the white flashlight beam. It was Laura's wool scarf, the thick wine-red one her friends could recognize from a block away. The scarf lay twisted, as if it had been tossed rather than dropped naturally. The officer carefully lifted one corner with gloved fingers, revealing the grass beneath pressed down in a curved shape, as if the scarf hadn't fallen straight, but had been yanked in one direction and flung aside. What struck them most, though, was how unusually clean it was. No blood, no mud, no tears, zero signs of a struggle, yet its position made no sense. If Laura had simply dropped it by accident, if she'd stayed on the main path toward the dorm, the scarf couldn't possibly have ended up in bushes that far off the walkway, especially on a night without strong wind. One officer stepped back several meters to view the discovery spot from a wider angle. From there, the main path was almost an arm's length from the bushes. For the scarf to land that deep, it had to have been thrown or ripped off Laura in a sudden motion. The flashlight swept the surrounding area, and broken weeds bent diagonally only reinforced the idea that something had been dragged or shoved into the brush, rather than accidentally dropped. Another officer knelt at the edge of the grass, using a probe to dig through the thin snow. Beneath the icy crust were faint scrape marks, like shoe scuffs or drag lines, but too faint to identify. Still, the fact that those scrapes ran directly from the dark spot the team had marked earlier sent chills down their spines. Everything they'd found, the scarf lying off to the side, the pressed grass, the faint drags under the snow, formed a picture of something abnormal. Not conclusive proof, but the first physical signs that the route Laura took was not as safe as everyone had assumed. Police immediately staked the area with reflective markers and strung tape in a half-moon around the bushes. They aimed patrol car floodlights to preserve any remaining traces. Finding the scarf carried two critical meanings. First, Laura had definitely walked this far. Second, and far more frightening, something sudden had happened here strong enough to rip the scarf from her neck. One of the most experienced investigators on scene stood silent for a long time before speaking, noting that the way the scarf had been discarded suggested a loss of control. Or pulled, he said quietly. No need to finish the thought, everyone understood. The search team fanned out wider, forming a radius around the bushes. They moved slowly, sweeping lights from the ground up tree trunks and low fences behind, looking for any sign Laura had been taken in another direction. One officer spotted more broken weeds, bending toward a narrow side path leading into a dark empty lot between two buildings. That path was almost never used at night. No lights, blocked by overlapping trees, forming a natural dark tunnel. When flashlights hit it, the snow inside looked messier, not smooth like elsewhere. It could have been animals, wind, or human movement. An investigator leaned in closer, studying how the marks overlapped. He lightly tapped the thin ice with his flashlight tip, then said softly, "Someone stood here, or something was dragged in here." From this distance, the dark path into the empty lot looked like a black void swallowing the light. One team member turned off his flashlight for a few seconds to simulate the lighting conditions Laura would have faced that night. When the light went out, everything vanished into total darkness. The path itself seemed to disappear. That only strengthened the conclusion that Laura could have been forced to stop or blocked at the point of poorest visibility on her route. When they turned the lights back on, the beams swept across the scarf marker, the broken grass, the dark path into the lot. Every small piece now linked together into one terrifying possibility. Laura had not left that path willingly. Someone had approached her, and the scarf flung into the bushes was the first physical proof of it. While one investigative team stayed at the scarf discovery site to expand the search radius, the rest of the Gallatin County Police continued sweeping the side roads Laura might have taken. Dawn was approaching, but the air was still thick with cold, the pavement reflecting patrol car lights in trembling silver patches. As they reached the area near Caggie Boulevard, a sharp-eyed officer noticed a light-colored sedan parked well off the curb, as if someone had pulled over in a hurry and left without bothering to straighten it. Police aimed their floodlights straight at the vehicle, and the moment the beams swept across, they immediately recognized the familiar license plate, registered to Laura Ellington. Finding the car brought no relief. Instead, it froze everyone in place as disturbing possibilities flooded their minds. Laura's car should have been in the lot near the store, or close to the dorms, not in some unfamiliar spot far from her usual route, and certainly not parked crooked like this. One officer approached and touched the hood. It was ice cold. The engine had been off long enough to cool completely, though exactly how long was impossible to tell. He crouched to examine the tires and how they sank into the thin ice along the curb. Based on the depth and the frost on the windows, the car had been sitting there for at least a few hours, possibly, or possibly not, coinciding with the time Laura vanished. The driver's door was slightly ajar, just enough for wind to whistle through and make it rattle with every strong gust. Notably, there were no signs of forced entry or prying. Under flashlight beams, the door edges looked clean, no scratches, pry marks, or any evidence of tampering. One officer tugged the handle, and it opened instantly, unlocked, no resistance. Inside, everything was strangely intact, seats undisturbed, her bag still on the passenger side floor, radio off, all switches normal. No blood, no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings as in a fight. The driver's seat still had the familiar indentation of Laura's body, but it was reclined farther back than usual, as if someone else had adjusted it before leaving. The lead officer leaned into the cabin, slowly sweeping his flashlight across surfaces. The beam landed on the center console, where a small receipt lay in the cup holder tray. It was printed from a convenience store in a completely different part of town, nearly halfway across from where Laura worked. The timestamp fell after her shift ended, yet no one remembered her mentioning stopping there, and more importantly, the items on the receipt didn't match her habits. a canned coffee she never drank, and a spicy snack she avoided because of a mild allergy. That detail made the air inside the car feel heavier. One officer quietly thought someone else might have been in the car after Laura disappeared, and that receipt wasn't hers. Using gloved hands, police carefully folded the receipt and sealed it into an evidence bag. Another officer checked the floor mats. No unusual mud. The gas and brake pedals had no clear footprints, only faint smudges they couldn't attribute. Opening the trunk revealed only Laura's gym clothes and a few textbooks, all neatly arranged as always. That very neatness heightened the wrongness. If Laura had abandoned the car here for some reason, she would surely have locked it, taken her bag, or at least secured her things. There was no reason to leave the door wide open on a freezing night. Police immediately cordoned off the area, called in forensics to photograph, dust for prints, measure the car's position, and analyze surfaces. They placed reflective stakes around it, strung tape across the entire stretch of road, turning the spot into the second official crime scene of the disappearance. A veteran officer stood staring at the car in silence, shoulders tense. He didn't need to speak loudly for everyone to understand what he was thinking. This wasn't simply where Laura parked and walked away. The car was off her normal route, showed no signs the owner had driven herself away, and the door was left ajar, as if hastily closed by someone unfamiliar with it. "Someone else parked it here," he said quietly.
"Not her."
That statement sealed the scene. The car was now treated as a secondary scene, a dump site after Laura had already been taken. And in the winter silence of that Montana road, with police lights pulsing rhythmically across the snow, everyone understood that finding Laura's car didn't ease their minds. It only opened a deeper layer of the mystery surrounding her disappearance. The moment Laura's car was classified as a secondary scene, the forensics team immediately began collecting trace evidence around the area. The pavement near Kagi Boulevard had a thin layer of ice mixed with gravel, good enough to preserve tire tracks even if not as crisp as fresh snow. When patrol floodlights were aimed at the ground, faint tire grooves appeared like watered-down pencil lines. Investigators crouched low, using rulers and high-powered flashlights to differentiate which marks belonged to Laura's car and which did not. Right away they noted something abnormal. At least two distinct sets of tire tracks overlapped around the parking spot. One set matched Laura's tires perfectly, but the other, wider, deeper, with a completely different tread pattern, could not possibly belong to her small sedan. Notably, the unknown tracks appeared right beside the driver's door and on the shoulder behind the car, as if another vehicle had pulled up alongside Laura's for a brief stop. Investigators scraped thin layers of soil beneath the marks to analyze compression and direction. One officer concluded the deeper tracks were unusually pronounced for the dry surface, indicating either a heavier vehicle or a sudden stop. Laura's tracks, by contrast, barely compressed the surface, consistent with a gentle, quick parking job. This led to a chilling possibility. The second vehicle may have brought Laura here, while her own car was moved and abandoned to mislead investigators. As forensics widened their sweep, an officer near the wooden fence along the side road suddenly called everyone over. On a board less than 3 hand widths off the ground, a small beige fabric scrap was caught between rough splinters. It was too small to be from a heavy coat, but the size and material made it clear it wasn't from the car or anything in the trunk. The scrap looked torn from something softer, possibly a shirt, handkerchief, or clothing lining. Under flashlight, the fibers glinted oddly against the dark wood and ice, like a leftover puzzle piece the perpetrator hadn't noticed. Using tweezers, the investigator removed it, sealed it in a clear plastic bag, and labeled it evidence. The only question now, whose was it, and why was it snagged at a height that perfectly matched an adult's shoulder or arm? If that person had been forced or dragged against the fence. No one needed to voice the theories running through their heads. While they continued photographing and documenting, a door across the street unexpectedly opened. A middle-aged man in a thick sweater stepped onto his porch. He said he'd heard the police cars arrive, and when asked if he'd heard anything the previous night, furrowed his brow trying to recall. He hadn't seen anyone, but he had heard an unusually loud car door slam, like someone closing it hard out of haste or anger. The sound carried clearly because the neighborhood was almost dead silent. A single loud slam on a cold night travels far. He was certain that seconds later he heard no engine start, which immediately caught the officer's attention. If the vehicle stayed quiet after the slam, a brief struggle, dragging or forced action could have happened in that tiny window. When the man added that the sound came from the exact stretch where Laura's car now sat, the air among the officers standing at the scene seemed to freeze. The beige fabric, the unknown tire tracks, the loud slam, and Laura's crookedly parked sedan, all began connecting into a dark logical chain. Another vehicle had stopped beside Laura's. Someone had slammed the door hard enough to startle a neighbor. Laura did not drive herself here. The car was parked by someone unfamiliar with the seat position, the controls, and possibly with very different intentions. Forensics continued examining marks behind the car. They found faint drag lines running toward a narrow side road, as if someone had pulled something heavy or resisted being pulled. The marks weren't clear shoe prints, but their direction made the entire team pause. They led deeper into the same dark area the earlier search team had flagged as suspicious. An experienced investigator stood in the middle of the scene, eyes sweeping every piece of evidence, then said simply, "Someone handled this car, but didn't clean up everything." He had no idea that statement would become a cornerstone of the entire investigation. Because right then, even though Laura was still missing, the scattered clues, the scarf flung into the bushes, the unknown tire tracks, the beige fabric, the loud door slam, were starting to form the faint outline of someone standing in the dark. Someone who knew how to move at night. Someone fast, silent, and confident enough to leave the victim's car, where no one would think to look. And every investigator understood, the cleaner a secondary scene appears, the more complex what's being hidden behind it usually is. Once the beige fabric was sealed, and Laura's car officially designated a secondary scene, the investigative team moved into what they called initial noise filtering, where every possibility had to be laid out and vetted for plausibility. The first person they considered was Laura's boyfriend, standard procedure in missing young woman cases. Police contacted him that same night and brought him in for questioning. However, after checking his schedule, cross-referencing the time he was working at a restaurant in Helena, and confirming it with internal cameras and co-workers, they quickly cleared him. All evidence showed he couldn't have been in Bozeman when Laura disappeared, and the panic in his voice upon hearing the news showed no sign of acting. The first gap was filled, and the team moved on immediately. Everyone who had worked with Laura that night was called in for statements. The female co-worker on the same shift confirmed a detail that had already caught police attention. A few days earlier, a strange man had come into the store asking Laura personal questions unrelated to merchandise, where she lived, whether she often walked alone, what time she finished at night. Laura had just smiled awkwardly, refused to answer, and found an excuse to walk away. The man left no name, phone number, or any information. The co-worker's description was brief, roughly 30, 40 years old, tall, unkempt face, dark jacket. Not enough for a full profile, but the recent behavior instantly placed him on the suspect list. Police began rounding up every man in the area, matching the description, who had a history of harassment or stalking women. It didn't yield immediate results, but it marked the second initial suspect. Meanwhile, another lead came from two separate calls by local residents. Both reported seeing a dark green pickup truck lingering near the dorm area the evening Laura vanished, then speeding away toward back roads leading to open land. They described the green as the distinctive dark shade common on older work trucks or service vehicles. That information instantly caught the team's attention, because the unknown tire tracks around Laura's car belonged to a larger vehicle, not a small sedan. If that green pickup was present at the exact time and in the exact area where suspicious signs had been found, it couldn't be mere coincidence. From three elements, the strange man in the store, the loud door slam heard by a witness, and the dark green pickup seen at the same time, the police split the investigation into three clear branches. The first focused on the man who appeared in the store. That team combed records of every local man matching the description, checked whatever primitive 1984 security cameras existed nearby, and reviewed reports of stalking incidents over the past year. The second branch concentrated on signs of approach at the secondary scene, checking every vehicle registered or frequently used near Kagi Boulevard, especially those matching the unknown tire size. They needed to know who owned large trucks, who habitually parked at night near Laura's disappearance route, and who had prior suspicious behavior around the university. The third, and potentially most dangerous, branch traced the dark green pickup. This was the hardest, because Montana in that era was full of such trucks, but witness descriptions of how it drove off, where it stopped, and the timing helped narrow the search area. Police also contacted repair shops, owners of older trucks, and even construction companies to see if any vehicle matched. With all three branches running in parallel, police knew they were racing the clock. The beige fabric and unknown tire tracks proved Laura hadn't left her car willingly. The scarf in the bushes proved she hadn't voluntarily left her usual path. And the green pickup, if connected, could be the key to the entire night. In Bozeman's knife-cold darkness, the team stood around Laura's car, each focused on their own target, but all understood they had just crossed a critical line from scattered early clues. They were beginning to build the picture of someone deliberate, calculated, and who may have been watching Laura before striking. The investigation was no longer about finding a lost person. It was about hunting an active abductor. As the three investigative branches rolled out, the scene team returned to Laura's walking route for a crucial task, reconstructing her entire movement that night, based on what remained on the ground, in the air and in the shadows between streetlights. The cold was still brutal. Last night's thin snow swept into uneven patches by wind, but for the investigators those small distortions were the key. They started at the grocery store where Laura worked, walking the exact direction she had taken according to coworker and resident statements. Every step was compared to the faint footprints still visible in the snow, though most had been erased by wind. Last night's wind had blown from the north, down from the Bridger Mountains into town, a seemingly minor detail that helped them determine which marks were destroyed first, and which later. In the direction Laura would have walked, footprints should have been heavily erased, yet when they reached the scarf area, they discovered something illogical. The faint drag marks beneath the snow were less wind-damaged than the thinner marks farther back. This made them stop and analyze. If Laura had walked straight from the store toward the dorms, early sections of the route should have retained more prints, or at least not been wiped completely clean. In reality, the snow along the main path was almost smooth, showing no sign Laura had passed, while near the scarf the snow showed drag ripples and slight disturbance. One investigator crouched for a closer look, comparing grooves to wind direction. He pointed to a spot right at the bush edge and told his partner, this wasn't broken by wind. Someone stepped on it after fresh snow had started forming the top layer. That meant one or more people had been in the scarf area, but not necessarily Laura. The team backtracked about 20 meters from the scarf. There, between two long dark gaps of sparse streetlights, they found very shallow parallel depressions. They didn't look like human footprints, more like something sliding, maybe smooth-soled shoes, no-tread boots or drag marks. Based on depth and length, these appeared before the strong wind hit, meaning they were older than the marks around the scarf. A veteran snow analysis officer knelt to examine the ice compression beneath. He noted the surface was horizontally compacted, not the vertical compression of normal walking. This led to a critical conclusion. The stretch police thought Laura had walked might not actually be where she went. They pulled out the route map and marked the two spots in different colors. When connected, the path the snow and wind revealed deviated significantly from the assumed route. Most confusing, the scarf location didn't lie on that deviated path either. It was off to the side, as if the scarf had been thrown or pulled in a completely different direction. After studying the terrain repeatedly, one investigator offered, the scarf was placed there, not dropped there. The air thickened for a few seconds as everyone looked again at the bushes. It didn't fit any logical snow-indicated path. If Laura had stayed on the main route, the scarf couldn't have landed that deep in the brush. If she had been forced to stop near the dark gap between lights, she couldn't have thrown it there either. The only way the scarf ended up in that spot was if it had been moved. Question: moved by whom, and why? The team re-walked the key points, and realized Laura's actual disappearance point, where snow first showed disturbance, was nearly 25 meters from where the scarf was found. Using wind direction, drag depth and snow accumulation on branches, they became almost certain Laura had been approached at a different spot, and the scarf was either brought to the bushes to mislead or fell off, while someone dragged her toward the side road. Standing in the middle of the route, flashlight beams crossing the two contradictory points, the real disappearance spot and the scarf location, every investigator understood they had just touched a crucial segment. The first piece of evidence had been displaced from its true position. That meant whoever approached Laura didn't just act quickly, they deliberately tampered with the scene. Someone not impulsive, but calculated, and reconstructing the route on the snowy ground, had revealed exactly that. Confirming the scarf had been moved shook the entire direction of the investigation, because it meant Laura's abductor hadn't just acted fast, they had stayed calm enough to plant misdirection. This forced investigators to consider the worst-case scenario: Laura may have been taken out of town that very night, and with narrow roads leading into Gallatin Canyon just minutes from where her car was found, one of Montana's widest and wildest mountain areas, police had to expand the search dramatically. A K-9 unit was called in from a nearby support division, bringing 3 dogs trained for tracking in cold, windy conditions. When the K-9 truck arrived, the sky had turned the pale gray of early morning, frost mist rising from the pavement like thin smoke covering everything. Investigators led the dogs to the last logical drag point of Laura's trail, and let them scent from there. At first the K-9s reacted strongly, pulling hard toward a narrow dirt track heading into Gallatin Canyon, a rarely used winter path of rock and ice. Within minutes, the dogs' excitement confirmed they had Laura's scent, or at least the scent of clothes she had worn. They pulled their handlers roughly 250 meters, moving urgently as if they knew the way. Then abruptly, at a sharp bend hidden by thick trees, all 3 dogs stopped at once. They sniffed the ground in tight circles, but refused to go farther. This wasn't weather-related trail loss. It was the classic break that happens when the target is lifted off the ground, or loaded into a vehicle, cutting the scent trail. The lead handler confirmed what everyone already suspected: she was put into a vehicle here. The mood grew heavy as the team fanned out to examine the road and surrounding dirt. In just minutes they found a detail that chillingly matched the theory: a large tire impression half buried under snow on the hard-packed earth. The tread pattern was completely different from the marks beside Laura's car: wider, deeper, clearly off-road tires. The tire analyst knelt, measured groove width, then confirmed, not civilian. These are all-terrain. Notably, the track only ran one way out from town. Depth analysis showed the vehicle was heavier than normal, as if carrying extra weight passengers or cargo. One officer tapped the compressed soil beneath with a steel rod. Results showed the tires had stopped, not just rolled through, meaning that vehicle had halted exactly where the dogs lost the scent. While the team analyzed the track, a young volunteer searcher shouted from the bushes. He had spotted a small object at the base of a tree trunk, a single gray work glove, men's size, thick winter type, but not women's. Far too large and rough for Laura. Picked up with evidence gloves, snow fell away revealing frayed cuff edges from heavy use. No blood, no tears, but the style was common among mechanics, truck drivers, or anyone working outdoors in cold. One officer brought it close to his nose. No strong machine oil, just wood and dust. It wasn't placed where someone would normally drop it. Combined with the tire track and the exact K-9 cutoff, the glove practically marked the real abduction point. As they widened the search radius deeper into Gallatin Canyon, reality set in. This was no longer an urban search. This was wilderness. Wind screamed through tall pines like a mountain warning. The ground was rocky, steep, crisscrossed with countless small trails, making tracking on thin snow nearly impossible. Locals joked that Gallatin Canyon was big enough that a person could disappear here in half a day. Teams spread out with GPS and radios, but after only a few hundred meters the slope steepened, trees thickened, and light faded. One investigator muttered, "If he brought Laura in here, he knows the area." No one argued. A stranger would struggle to navigate Montana winter backcountry, but someone who lived, worked, or traveled here often was different. The team looked again at the deep off-road track and the abandoned glove, then into the pitch-black trail snaking into Gallatin Canyon like the mouth of a cave. They all understood they had left the familiar town behind, and were now entering the territory of whoever took Laura, a person not just fast and strong, but who knew exactly how to use the mountains and forest to vanish. The discovery of the large tire tracks and the work glove at the entrance to Gallatin Canyon convinced the investigative team they were extremely close to the point where the perpetrator took Laura out of town. But the deeper they pushed the search, the more they realized Montana's mountains and forests do not yield easily. High winds, thin snow, and rugged terrain erased every trace before they could follow it further. And when they returned to the residential area to re-interview witnesses, contradictions began to appear like another layer of fog shrouding the case, slowly pulling the investigation backward. The first witness, who had claimed to see a dark green pickup speeding away from the dorm area the night Laura vanished, was brought in for a second interview. This time, however, he was far less certain. He frowned, struggling to recall, then said the truck might not have been dark green after all, maybe moss green or even light blue. The streetlights and snow reflection made it hard to tell. When asked about size, he first described a large pickup, then said it might have been smaller because it was far away, hard to be sure. Worse, when pressed for a license plate or make, he remembered nothing at all. Those vague details made the most important lead wobble dangerously. The second witness, the one who had called police about a pickup racing toward Gallatin Canyon, also changed her story under closer questioning. At first she said it sped and turned sharply, as if in a hurry. On second telling, she hesitated, and said the driver might simply have been avoiding a patch of ice. When asked if she was sure the truck left town, or merely turned onto another street, she paused a long time before admitting, not really sure, it was dark, hard to see. Two statements about the same truck, yet both warped on repeat, turning what had seemed a clear lead into something as murky as the frost on Laura's car windows. Meanwhile, police received another statement, this time from a man living near the south corner of the dorm area. He said that night he heard arguing, a louder male voice mixed with the howling wind. When asked to describe it further, he only shook his head, saying the wind whistling through cracks made it impossible to catch words, or even confirm a female voice was present. He remembered it lasted only a few seconds, and wasn't sure it had anything to do with Laura. When asked if the sound came from the direction where Laura's car was later found, he hesitated again, then said maybe, but it could also have come from the next street over. The statement offered a flicker of hope, but nothing solid, no description of voices, no exact time, no certainty it involved Laura or the perpetrator. The deeper they probed, the vaguer it became, unusable as evidence. At the same time, investigators tried to pin down the final movement of the rumored green pickup, but in 1984, Bozeman, there were virtually no security cameras, and residents near the back roads into Gallatin Canyon only recalled fragments, a shadow, an engine revving, a loud door slam, nothing that fit together like proper puzzle pieces. A veteran Gallatin County investigator felt the leads fracturing, every statement seemed blown off course by wind, every detail reduced to its own shadow, useless for identifying a perpetrator or final direction. Even the large tire track in the forest meant nothing without the vehicle that made it, and that opened a list of dozens of possible vehicles in Montana at the time. In the knife-sharp cold of a gray Bozeman morning, the officers returned to the secondary scene, with a heavy feeling. Laura's car still sat there, silent as a locked secret, the beige fabric scrap in its evidence bag, the scarf in the bushes, the tire track in the woods, all existed, yet none would connect when witness statements turned tangled and contradictory. One investigator wrote in his report, "Early stage shows multiple movements around the scene, but sequence cannot be determined." That sentence embodied the truth. The case was entering darkness, and in that darkness, every scattered trace began to fade, as if an invisible hand were gently wiping away each clue before it could lead anywhere important. The official investigation hit its first deadlock. In the days that followed the emergence of contradictory statements, The atmosphere at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office grew as heavy as the frost clinging to patrol car windows on frigid mornings. Every seemingly hopeful lead withered the moment police tried to verify it. Each detail dissolving like breath in Montana's cold wind. The dark green pickup, once considered the most critical clue, became little more than a jumbled memory among witnesses. One said it was large, another said smaller, one recalled it speeding, another insisted it merely turned gently onto a side street. No one provided anything clear enough to tie to the scene. Investigators felt trapped in a circle of infinite possibilities, with no evidence to turn them into facts. Every report sent upstairs read the same: no further developments, insufficient basis. Search yielded no results. The phrases repeated so often, the officers practically memorized them. When the K-9 unit was brought back to Gallatin Canyon one more time the following week, weather had worsened, deeper snow, stronger wind, and whatever traces once existed on the trail were long gone. Rocky paths, steep slopes, and dense pine forest turned the area into a frozen maze, impossible to track the way the searchers hoped. After only a few hours, they had to conclude that no trace of Laura remained there, and perhaps never had. In town, people began avoiding mention of the disappearance. In coffee shop talk or grocery store lines, Laura's name shifted from alarm to casual remarks. Maybe the girl just left town. Could have been an accident they never found. Montana's huge. Who knows? Those comments weren't callous. They came from fear. Something had happened to a young woman in a quiet small town, and having no answer was more unsettling than knowing the truth. In the small investigative team's meeting room, the map with red-marked locations still hung: scarf site, car site, trail loss in Gallatin Canyon. The 3 points were far enough apart to make the entire case a logical labyrinth, yet close enough to feel everything was within reach, if only one more clue appeared. But that clue never did. After 3 months of no progress, the special unit was ordered to reduce manpower and prioritize solvable cases. The 3 lead officers, who had been there from the first day Laura vanished, were reassigned to routine duties. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. This was the first step before the file officially became a cold case. On the team's final gathering day, they sat around the long table covered with maps, scene photos, and small evidence bags. Laura's wine-red scarf lay in clear plastic beside the beige fabric scrap, and photos of the large tire track in Gallatin Canyon. The silence was so complete they could hear a pen roll off the table. An older investigator looked at each item, knowing these had once been hope. Now they were only scattered pieces of something they could never see whole. After the meeting, all evidence was resealed, relabeled, renumbered. Each bag went into a locked metal box, and was placed in a cold, dark storage room almost no one ever entered. The heavy steel door closed with a sharp metallic thud, the period at the end of the initial investigation. The file Laura Ellington, missing person, was officially moved to unsolved cases, a small but icy line on paper: status, cold case. Laura's name no longer came up in morning briefings. No patrol rechecked her walking route. No one asked about the green pickup anymore. Her traces were buried under dust as thick as Bozeman's winter snow, waiting for someone, someday, to open that metal door again and look at the forgotten clues. But in 1984, that person had not yet appeared, and Laura Ellington, the girl who vanished in Montana's cold, officially became a name in a file lying silent in storage, a file no one knew when, or if, it would ever be reopened. 7 years after Laura Ellington disappeared, her file lay undisturbed in the cold steel cabinet of the records room, pulled out only occasionally by new personnel or someone reviewing old Gallatin County cases for training. No new leads, no surprise calls, no sign the case could ever be solved, until one summer night in 1991, when in a rundown bar near the highway, a drunk man slammed his glass on the table and shouted over blaring rock music, "I know about that girl from '84. At first no one paid attention. Drunk Montanans often talked nonsense, but a regular who heard '84 immediately thought of the disappearance the town had once buzzed about. The next day he reported it to police. The tip sent to the department contained nothing but a vague description: middle-aged man, salt and pepper hair, raspy voice, looked like a drifter, occasional customer at that bar. Though the case had long been cold, police still sent 2 officers to the bar, hoping even a scrap of information might reignite it. When they arrived, the bartender recognized the description, but said the man was just a passer-through, drank alone, never talked to anyone. Yet the bartender clearly remembered what the man had blurted the night before, the tone too certain for drunken rambling. Police decided to stake out the bar for several nights, but the man never returned. 3 days later, a call came from state police. The body of a homeless man had been found on vacant land near the interstate. No ID, no belongings, except a few coins and a torn jacket. When they brought the body for identification, the bartender confirmed it was the man who had said, "I know about that girl from '84. The coincidence silenced the entire briefing room. They asked cause of death. The preliminary forensic report listed suspected asphyxiation due to substance use and hypothermia. No signs of violent assault, no evidence of clear homicide, but the timing of the death sent chills through everyone. A young officer couldn't hide his suspicion. If he really knew something, did someone want him quiet? The question hung in the cold reality. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing to go on except the dying words of a drunk. When police searched the jacket, they found only crumpled papers, an empty cigarette pack, and an unrelated old receipt. No note, no map, no information about Laura, nothing suggesting he actually knew anything. But the strangest item among the pocket contents was a small flat stone worn smooth on the edges, the kind commonly found on the trailhead into Gallatin Canyon, where the K-9s had lost the scent 7 years earlier. When investigators asked the bartender if the man had ever mentioned the canyon or the mountains, the bartender shook his head. The man hardly ever spoke. The comment about the girl from '84 was the first time he had ever sounded so clear. No one knew why he said it that night, why he carried a stone from that area, or why he died right after mentioning the case. Everything remained vague shadows in other people's memories, impossible to verify or follow. The file was pulled once more, only long enough for officers to add a note, source unverifiable, insufficient grounds to reopen investigation. Then it went back into the steel cabinet, returning to its place, a dusty cold case where the final words of a drunk man still hung like an unprovable whisper. One single sentence, "I know about that girl from '84, left more haunting questions than answers. Because everyone understood, either he really knew something, or liquor had distorted a memory. Either way, he took it to the grave, and no one could ever open that statement again. The Laura Ellington case, once more sank into silence. More than 4 decades after Laura Ellington vanished, her file still sat on the lowest shelf of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office storage cabinet, a quiet reminder of a case that never found an answer. The investigators who had worked it were either retired or gone, and for younger Bozeman residents Laura had become little more than a vague story, floating in their parents' generation's memory. No one expected that in the summer of 2025 it would be construction workers, not police or hikers, who accidentally restarted a case everyone thought was forgotten forever. On the morning of July 18th, while a crew working on the US 191 widening project was digging deep into old soil to lay new cable, the excavator operator suddenly stopped mid-scoop. The bucket had just flipped up a thick layer of earth when he spotted something lying exposed at the edge of the hole, something that didn't belong among natural rock and dirt. It was a curved, slender bone, ivory white, smooth at one end, and rough at the other. At first he thought it was animal, but when sunlight hit it directly, the size and shape made his blood run cold. It looked far too human. Other workers ran over, and in the few seconds of silence, everyone understood they had touched something they couldn't handle themselves. The site foreman immediately called police. Within 20 minutes the area was taped off in yellow, patrol cars lined both sides of the highway, and the Gallatin County forensics team arrived, faces grim, because finding human bones near US 191 meant the strong possibility of disturbing a decades-old case the whole town had once heard about. As forensic experts knelt at the pit's edge, they uncovered 2 more bone fragments deeper down and a small piece a few inches away. But what shifted the atmosphere from curiosity to genuine shock was the object lying right beside the first bone. A flashlight beam glinted off a thin, small, round piece of metal. One technician gently brushed away the clinging dirt. A bracelet. Not expensive jewelry, but a simple hand-engraved silver band, the kind sold at small Montana markets in the late 70s and early 80s. And it looked eerily like the bracelet Laura Ellington had been documented wearing in photos before 1984. The technician held the bracelet in gloved fingers up to the light. Though the silver had tarnished over the years, the tiny engraved stream pattern on both sides was still visible. The design Laura had loved because it reminded her of a childhood fishing spot with her family. When the forensic team exchanged glances, no one needed to speak. If the bracelet was real, if it truly belonged to Laura, then the skeleton beneath this dirt might be the girl who vanished over 40 years ago. The report went straight to headquarters. When the call came in, the duty officer, too young to know all the details of the Laura case, had to pull the old file to confirm that Laura had indeed worn a distinctive engraved silver bracelet, and the archive description matched roughly 90% of what had just been found. Within an hour, representatives from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, a veteran cold case investigator, and an expanded forensics team were on site. The cordon was widened to over 50 square meters. The excavator was shut down completely. Workers were told to stand back. A camera was set up to record the entire recovery. Excavating decades-old human remains requires near absolute precision. Any mistake could destroy the last clues left after decades. The team removed soil layer by layer, roots, pebbles. They recovered more fragments, a section of rib, part of an arm bone, a worn knee joint. Though identity couldn't be confirmed on site, preliminary indicators all pointed to a young woman. When the silver bracelet was carefully placed into evidence bag 001, 2025 LAE, the initials LAE, Laura Ellington, appeared on the sealed label. It proved nothing yet, but it could not be random coincidence. The lead investigator on scene requested the 1984 file, specifically the jewelry description section. When compared to old photos, the match was nearly perfect. Same style, same size, same engraving. Word spread fast inside the Bozeman department. The Laura Ellington case, the town's unsolved legend for 4 decades, might have just found its first real piece. As bone samples and the bracelet were transported to the lab, the lead investigator stood staring down the long stretch of US 191 toward Gallatin Canyon, where vehicles sped past unaware that right beside them, the past had just risen from the ground. And in the moment a strong valley wind whipped through, he understood that a file locked away for years would no longer stay quiet. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office officially reopened the Laura Ellington case. Everything was starting again, from the bones just unearthed, and from the small silver bracelet that had lain in the earth for over 40 years. The bone samples taken to the Gallatin County Forensic Lab were processed the same day, but for modern identification the team had to coordinate with the state lab in Helena. As the fragments were laid on the cold metal table, the technicians who had never lived through the era when Laura's disappearance shook the town knew only that they held the potential to reopen one of Montana's longest-running files. They extracted genetic material from the femur, the bone that best preserves DNA over time, and sent a portion to the state lab for mtDNA analysis, since mitochondrial DNA survives decades and can be directly compared to maternal relatives. Laura's mother, though elderly and frail, was still alive in Helena. When police knocked to request a comparison sample, she stood frozen for a long moment, gripping the doorframe, as if to steady a memory she had suppressed for over 40 years. She asked almost nothing, only nodded and extended her arm for the swab. Her voice trembled slightly as she signed the consent form. If it's her, I want to know. Whatever the answer is. Her sample was rushed to the lab. Back at Gallatin County, investigators waited in silence, each feeling as if they stood before a door to the past that could swing open any second. It took only 3 days for the lab to return a preliminary report. In the cold investigative office, where Laura's silver bracelet still lay on the table in its evidence bag, the lead investigator opened the long yellow envelope, read the contents, and said nothing for several seconds. Then he looked up, his eyes carrying an emotion hard to describe. Not quite relief, not quite grief, but confirmation of something everyone had known yet never proven. The mtDNA matched perfectly with Laura's mother. The skeleton found beneath the edge of US 191 was Laura Ellington. The news spread through the department so fast some people knew before the second report was even printed. But just as that truth began to settle, the lab sent another piece of information that complicated everything. During evidence analysis, a technician had decided to swab the inside of the silver bracelet, the surface that had rested directly against the wearer's skin, even though protocol said metal that old was unlikely to retain DNA. Yet when the results came back, they found trace DNA from two distinct profiles. The first was presumed with certainty to be Laura's. The degradation pattern still contained segments consistent with the confirmed mtDNA. But the second belonged to a male. One technician read the report 3 times before signing it. That DNA did not belong to any construction worker, forensic tech, or officer who had handled the evidence. All had been ruled out by comparison samples. This was foreign DNA, adhering to an item Laura had worn before her disappearance. No one in the lab dared call it the abductor's DNA outright, but the entire investigative team understood the likelihood was high. SNP analysis confirmed it was male, and did not match any criminal profiles in the state CODIS at the initial check. But the most chilling detail was its location, the inside of the bracelet. Traces on the outside could come from a struggle, but the inside, the part pressed against Laura's wrist, could only carry DNA from someone extremely close to her, or who had directly touched her wrist in the moments very near her disappearance. When this report reached the lead investigator's desk, he stared at the silver bracelet on the table, as if it were both sacred and horrifying. For years it had been viewed merely as jewelry, a minor detail in a young woman's life. Now it was the only physical evidence directly linking Laura to an unidentified man. At the internal briefing when the DNA results were presented, the room fell so quiet the steady hum of the heater was audible. A young officer spoke first. If this is his DNA, he touched her wrist. Meaning, he left the sentence unfinished. Everyone understood the rest. The lead investigator stood, placing both hands on the table. We have the victim's identity, and now we have DNA from a male who came into contact with her before she died. This case is no longer a memory. It just came back to life. A report was immediately sent to the prosecutor's office, requesting full re-examination of the entire case. An urgent email went to an advanced DNA analysis unit to attempt newer methods, including genealogical comparison, which hadn't existed in 1984. The Laura Ellington file, after 41 years of silence, was officially reopened. No longer a forgotten cold case in a steel cabinet, it was a new investigation, with 2 brand new truths. Laura had been found, and she was not alone in the bracelet lying beside her bones. An unknown man had been there too, and the only question from now on was who is he? The moment the DNA results confirmed the skeleton beneath US 191 was Laura Ellington, and that a strange male DNA sample had appeared on the inside of her silver bracelet, the entire case structure, frozen solid for over 40 years, suddenly cracked open under the new light of modern forensics. The lead investigator immediately ordered every 1984 piece of evidence pulled from storage, items once dismissed as insufficient investigative value, including the wine-red scarf, the beige fabric scrap found on the fence near the secondary scene, photographs of the large tire track in Gallatin Canyon, and a fleck of light blue paint stuck in the dirt beside Laura's car that no one had ever sourced. All those forgotten items were laid out on the long table in Gallatin County's modern analysis room, under cold white lights, like memories that refused to rot, waiting 4 decades to be seen again. The first technician processed the small beige fabric scrap, once labeled simply unrelated fiber. Back then, technology couldn't decode it. In 2025, using multispectral fiber imaging and chemical fiber structure analysis, what had been unknown became clear. The fibers were heavy ripstop weave canvas, the kind used in U.S. military field jackets from the 1970s and early 1980s, specifically the M65 model, common among discharged soldiers, Montana hunters, and outdoor workers around Bozeman. The distinctive beige had faded slightly over time, and the torn edge showed it had been ripped or violently snagged on the fence, not dropped naturally. This left no doubt: the man who touched Laura's wrist, the one who left DNA on the bracelet, had very likely been wearing a military or military-style field jacket that night. But the bigger discovery came when the lab magnified the fiber structure. They found embedded dirt particles and microscopic paint flecks, and the paint color matched the blue paint chip collected beside Laura's car in 1984. Under Raman spectroscopy, that chip revealed pigments specific to Glacier Blue automotive paint, a metallic light blue used widely on 1974 Chevy and Ford pickups. The entire analysis room went dead silent. Glacier Blue was not random. It was not Laura's car color. It could only have come from the other vehicle, the green-blue pickup witnesses vaguely remembered in the first months of the search. Technicians then moved to the old photographs of the large tire track found on the trail into Gallatin Canyon. The prints had yellowed, but modern 3D tire track reconstruction software recreated groove depth and width. After hours of modeling, the result was unmistakable. The track matched BF Goodrich all-terrain tires, the off-road tire popular on modified mountain trucks in the 1970s and 1980s. No one on the team doubted any longer that tire did not belong on small sedans like Laura's or on standard commercial vehicles. It belonged to someone who knew Montana terrain, drove in forest and snow, and was likely a hunter or forestry worker. The convergence of three things: military jacket fabric, 1974 Glacier Blue paint, off-road tires, turned the room's tension into steel-cold silence. The lead investigator stood at the whiteboard and wrote 3 lines: beige fabric, military field jacket paint chip, Glacier Blue 1974 tire track, off-road pickup. Then he connected the 3 points into a simple triangle. If these 3 traces belong to the same person, he said slowly, then that person didn't just approach Laura. He brushed the fence while dragging her, stood next to her car, loaded her into his pickup, and vanished into Gallatin Canyon. No one argued. The 3 pieces were no longer separate. The beige fabric carried Glacier Blue paint. The Glacier Blue paint came from soil matching the dirt under the off-road tire track. The off-road tire track led to the trail where the K9s lost Laura's scent. They all fit together like the final pieces of a dark picture the 1984 investigators had only glimpsed through thick technological fog. A young forensic technician, who had never seen the Laura case as a child, but had studied every page of the old file, said one simple sentence that froze the room: "We have his traces at the secondary scene, on the trail, and on Laura's car." The lead investigator nodded slowly, and he wore a military field jacket, drove a Glacier Blue pickup, and touched her wrist. The 3 linked pieces of evidence pushed the investigation to a completely new level. Before, police had only Laura's scarf and a chain of disconnected clues. Now they could sketch a preliminary suspect profile: a physically strong man familiar with the mountains, capable of taking Laura into Gallatin Canyon, driving a 1974 Glacier Blue off-road pickup, not so rare that it couldn't be traced through DMV records. The lead investigator stared at the results, knowing the case had changed its nature. It was no longer about finding answers to Laura's death. It was about hunting the man who left the beige fabric, the Glacier Blue paint, and the off-road tire track on that dark road 40 years ago. A man who had been there, who had touched Laura, and who had vanished like a ghost into the Montana wilderness. But now, with 3 linked pieces of evidence, he was no longer a ghost. He had left real footprints, and the investigators knew, for the first time in 4 decades, they could follow them. The moment the final 3 1984 pieces of evidence, the beige military jacket fabric, the 1974 Glacier Blue paint, and the off-road pickup tire track, were connected into one logical chain, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office understood they stood at a critical turning point. From 3 scattered traces they could trace the vehicle, from the vehicle the owner, and from the owner, straight to the man who took Laura Ellington out of town that winter night. Evidence does not speak, but it pointed directly to one very specific target. The team's first move was to request Montana DMV to pull registration history for every 1974 pickup ever painted Glacier Blue or repainted in a similar shade. No one knew how long the list would be, but everyone understood that the narrower they made it, the closer they got to the person who drove Laura into Gallatin Canyon. When the DMV data poured into the office via internal access, the entire team gathered around the long table and opened a spreadsheet with dozens of lines: owner name, address at time of registration, transfer dates, vehicle status, VIN, color change notes, and sometimes tiny dealer comments. In the 1970s, 1980s, Montana had more Glacier Blue pickups than they expected. Total 1974 pickups, originally or later painted Glacier Blue, 53. The number was daunting. They couldn't chase every one in a short time. Instead of despair, the lead investigator simply tapped his pen on the board. "We don't need 53. We only need one." The team began filtering by criteria. First, geographic location. In 1984, they immediately dropped owners living east of the Continental Divide, hundreds of miles from Bozeman, too far for a pickup to appear randomly near the dorms the night Laura vanished. List dropped from 53 to 31. Second criterion, tire type. A technician scanned every recorded maintenance note for off-road or all-terrain tire upgrades. Not all owners kept records, but those serviced at major dealers or garages did. After the second filter, the list shrank to 23. Third criterion, owner background. They prioritized people with logical reasons to be in Bozeman. In winter 1984, hunters, forestry workers, discharged military, mechanics, mountain route drivers, occupations requiring travel through Gallatin Canyon, were flagged first. After occupational filtering, the list was down to 17 names, small enough to dig deep. But the surprise came when they cross-referenced 1984 residential addresses with the crime scene map. A young investigator noticed that of the 17, only one had lived less than 2 blocks from Laura's walking route. Harold Dunley, born 1951, resident in Bozeman until late 1986, then moved out of town. DMV records showed Dunley owned a 1974 Chevy K20 painted Glacier Blue, with a short 1983 note, rear bed repainted. No explanation given. The lead investigator stared at the file and circled the name in red. But the real jolt came on the next page. A local garage note from 1984 showing Dunley had installed exactly BF Goodrich all-terrain tires, the same brand and model that matched the Gallatin Canyon track. In the briefing room, the air froze. Everything they were looking for, Glacier Blue paint, off-road tires, someone living near Laura's route, outdoor military background, converged on one single name. Harold Dunley was not the only one left on the list of 17, but he was the only one who satisfied every single condition. When the young investigator handling demographic files pulled Dunley's old records, things grew darker. Dunley had served in the U.S. Army 1970, 1974, then returned to Montana. He held various jobs: generator mechanic, winter forestry worker, and for a period, worked on a road maintenance crew near Gallatin Canyon. The lead investigator's brow furrowed when he read the note: occasional contract work for Forest Service. That meant Dunley didn't just know Gallatin Canyon, he knew the exact terrain where trails intersected, the very spot where the K-9s lost Laura's scent in 1984. One officer blurted, "He has every single factor." The lead investigator didn't answer. He opened the file to a 1984 photo of Dunley: long face, deep-set eyes, hard jaw of a man used to heavy labor. The jacket in the photo was an M65 field jacket, faded beige. Flipping further, another chilling detail: in early 1985, Dunley had been briefly questioned for petty theft and minor harassment at a shopping area, but released after a few hours for lack of evidence. Nothing further noted, and most importantly, right after 1986, 2 years after Laura vanished, Dunley left Bozeman and moved to a forest cabin, living off-grid. From then on, he essentially disappeared from the map. The DMV's last known address, Hyalite Forest area, a remote location, left the team with no doubt. They couldn't yet prove Dunley was the man who took Laura into the woods in 1984, but every trace pointed at him like an arrow. Strangely, for 40 years his name had sat in the vehicle owner list and no one had asked, because in 1984 forensic technology wasn't advanced enough to see the clear connections now visible. The lead investigator set Dunley's file on the table and looked straight at the team. "If he's still alive," he said, "he knows the storm is coming." The room fell silent. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood. Every clue had converged. From here they weren't just chasing a 1974 Glacier Blue pickup, they were chasing Harold Dunley, the man at the intersection of Glacier Blue paint, B.F. Goodrich off-road tires, an M65 military jacket, and Laura Ellington's disappearance. And for the first time in 40 years, they had a real name. The moment Harold Dunley became the focus, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office obtained a search warrant for the cabin listed as his residence after 1986. The area lay deep in the Hyalite Forest, over 40 minutes from Bozeman on steep, narrow dirt roads, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. In early October 2025, police and forensics drove in using old GPS coordinates, entering a forest of towering pines that blocked light and turned morning into dusk. When the convoy stopped at the marked spot, Harold Dunley's cabin appeared, a weathered wooden structure with a patchy tin roof, frost-clouded windows, and a cold chimney. The cabin showed no signs of habitation for at least 20 years, yet it was suspiciously intact, as if preserved rather than abandoned. As officers approached, the ground was littered with dry pine needles, no fresh footprints, but faint tire marks in front of the cabin, old yet indicating a vehicle had stopped there within the last few years. They breached the front door lock with tools. The door swung open with a long groan, and the smell of damp rot mixed with old machine oil hit them immediately. The cabin was almost completely dark. Dust lay thick over everything like a burial shroud for the years Dunley had lived there. In the first room, they found seemingly harmless items: mechanic tools, empty metal paint cans, a rickety workbench with a broken lamp, but attention quickly fixed on the wall behind the bench, where an old Montana map took up nearly the entire surface. Dozens of red ink marks dotted various locations, but one area was circled far more heavily than the rest. Gallatin Canyon, exactly the stretch of trail where the K-9s lost Laura's scent in 1984. No one on the team spoke. They simply stared at the map as living proof that Dunley hadn't just known Gallatin Canyon. He had studied it, tracked it, or used it systematically. Beneath the map was an unlocked drawer filled with yellowed papers covered in scrawled notes and coordinates: side road, second entrance, avoid north in high wind. Though their exact meaning wasn't yet clear, the notes showed Dunley had traveled Gallatin Canyon frequently and knew enough to analyze weather and terrain, exactly the profile of someone who could take Laura into the forest without leaving traces. As forensics moved deeper, they opened an old trunk in the corner. Inside was a jumble of oil-stained items: old clothes, rope, a rusty handsaw, rolled up stiff fabric pieces. One technician pulled out a 10-centimeter strip of beige fabric, nearly identical to the fiber found on the fence at the 1984 secondary scene. Under bright light, the characteristic ripstop weave of an M65 field jacket was unmistakable, and crucially, the tear pattern matched the scrap caught on the fence 40 years earlier. No one dared say yet that this was the missing piece of the jacket the perpetrator wore while dragging Laura past the fence, but the match was too strong to be coincidence. The deeper they searched the cabin, the more pieces of the past surfaced. In a small wooden box, police found old paperwork, tire receipts, oil change records, and most importantly, 2 Glacier Blue paint purchase receipts from a local parts store, one from 1974 and another from 1983, noting rear bed repaint. That receipt matched the DMV note on Dunley's pickup exactly, but the most stunning moment of the search came when an investigator opened the small shed behind the cabin. Under a dusty tarp sat a 1974 Chevy K20, now painted faded gray from a later respray. Yet when forensics shone lights into the crevices between doors and the new paint, tiny patches of the original Glacier Blue still clung on. Those flecks, thin, faded, peeling, matched perfectly the paint chip recovered beside Laura's car. Furthermore, the truck still wore BF Goodrich all-terrain tires, old but the exact model that left the Gallatin Canyon track. Though the tires had been replaced multiple times, the terrifying fact was that the current set was still the same brand. Dunley's long-term preference, not a random change. One technician whispered, "Truck, paint, tires, jacket, everything is here." Dunley's cabin was like a complete archive of every scattered 1984 piece of evidence, only back then they lacked the technology to see the connections. Under the truck they also found an old parts box containing a loose metal jacket button. When compared to M65 field jacket samples, the button size matched exactly. No doubt remained. Dunley had worn a military field jacket. Dunley had repainted his truck Glacier Blue. Dunley had used off-road tires. Dunley had lived near Laura's walking route. Dunley had worked near Gallatin Canyon. And now Dunley had kept the very truck that matched the tire track at the trailhead. When the cabin was officially declared the primary scene, the lead investigator stepped outside to breathe, staring into the dark wall of pine trees. For years this man had lived here, minutes from deep forest no vehicle could enter, where an abductor could vanish down a single trail. And now, after more than 4 decades, the cabin was giving back every piece Dunley had tried to hide. No one said it aloud, but the feeling spread through the team. They were no longer investigating a name. They were standing inside the space of a man who had killed, who had concealed, who had disappeared, and everything in this cabin was shouting his name. Harold Dunley. And from this cabin the hunt for him from the past would begin. Once Harold Dunley's cabin was sealed as a crime scene, and the 1974 Chevy K20 was towed to the forensic center, the team understood the next phase would no longer be tracing physical clues, but tracing the human body itself, the kind of trace that no matter how long time had buried it, modern science could awaken from a single cell. After nearly a week at the cabin, forensics transported all critical evidence to the lab: the beige fabric from the old trunk, the remaining Glacier Blue paint under the truck's respray, the worn BF Goodrich tires, and most crucially, the silver bracelet, now the case's central exhibit, since the unknown male DNA was found on its inner surface. But this time, with the cabin, the truck, the M65 jacket, and items tied to Dunley, they had a real comparison source. Trace DNA analysis began immediately. Harold Dunley's DNA profile came from medical records in 2007, the last time he was treated at a small clinic before vanishing completely from Montana's healthcare system. Though old, the sample was sufficient for a reference profile. Meanwhile, the lab used the SDS Pro-Cro protocol on the silver bracelet, a method designed to extract DNA from aged metal surfaces. As technicians swabbed the inside of the bracelet, they barely breathed. Everyone knew that if Dunley's DNA was present, it would be the first direct link between him and Laura's body. After hours of centrifugation, extraction and amplification, the sample went into the high-end STR analyzer. When the results appeared, columns of DNA allele peaks, one technician broke the silence. "We have a match." The lead investigator rushed over. The report was clear. A portion of the trace DNA on the bracelet's inner surface matched Harold Dunley's reference genome. Not an indirect or genealogical match. This was a direct hit on 13 STR loci, more than enough to confirm Dunley had touched the bracelet Laura wore the night she vanished. The forensic room went quiet. For 41 years, they had never had proof any man had been that physically close to Laura. But as they continued examining the separation chart, something even more shocking appeared. The bracelet DNA wasn't only Dunley's, there was a clear second male genome, distinct, unmistakable, and matching nothing in their current database. One technician patiently marked each allele. "This sample is not Harold Dunley, it's someone else." In the room the STR machine kept humming, but the atmosphere grew heavier than steel. For the first time in the entire investigation, the concept of an accomplice became more than theory. They double-checked for contamination. None. The bracelet's inner surface had been cleaned multiple times. All lab contamination markers were ruled out. The second DNA profile was real. If Dunley's DNA lay where the bracelet met Laura's wrist, it proved he had directly grabbed, pulled, or held her wrist very close to the moment of abduction. But the second DNA sat right beside it, meaning during the time the bracelet contacted Laura's skin, at least one other man had been close enough to touch her wrist, or the bracelet itself, at the exact same moment. The lead investigator reread the chart. 2 samples, 2 men, on the same piece of evidence. The team looked at one another almost in unison. If it had been only Dunley, the story would have been simpler. But the presence of a second man opened a far heavier possibility. Laura had not been attacked by one man. She had been taken by 2 working together. That perfectly explained why no one ever heard loud screaming, why no clear struggle marks were found near the dorms. 2 men can overpower faster than one. One technician offered a chilling but logical hypothesis. If one held and one pulled, or one covered her mouth while the other grabbed the arm, it explains why the bracelet shifted and picked up DNA from both. The team immediately re-examined the cabin for traces of the second man. They compared remaining biological material, hair, skin cells, epithelial cells, but the cabin was too old, and samples too degraded for clean separation. However, on a metal cup left on the table, they recovered a usable epithelial sample. When run for comparison, it did not match Dunley, and was too degraded for a full STR profile. Still, it proved one critical thing: another man had been inside Dunley's cabin while it was still in use. No one knew who that man was, no one knew his role, but everything was beginning to form a terrifying pattern. Dunley had lived alone in the cabin, but not always by himself. When the lead investigator received the final report, he stood silently before the evidence board. The military jacket fabric, the off-road tire track, the Glacier Blue paint, the K9 loss of scent location, and now, DNA from 2 men on the bracelet that rose from the earth. Maybe he didn't work alone, he said quietly. Maybe there were 2 from the beginning. That thought sent chills down everyone's spine. It meant that for 40 years, the case hadn't just lain dormant in darkness. It might involve another man, never suspected, never mentioned in any report, and possibly still alive. The trace DNA had opened a door no one expected. The killer of Laura Ellington was not only Harold Dunley. In that moment of silence, everyone in the room knew that from now on the case was no longer hunting one ghost from 1984, it was hunting 2, and only DNA could drag them out of that thick fog. As soon as the forensic lab confirmed Harold Dunley's DNA on the inner surface of Laura Ellington's silver bracelet, an arrest warrant was signed in under 48 hours. This was no longer assumption, no longer conjecture. This was direct contact evidence that could not be explained away innocently. But arresting Dunley was anything but simple. He had vanished from ordinary life for years, living on society's edge, buried deep in the Hyalite forest like a ghost. On the night of November 12, 2025, the Gallatin County SWAT team and federal agents staged at the rally point below the tree line. No one knew for certain whether Dunley was still at the cabin or had moved on, but every sign from the earlier search, fresh food cans, still warm ashes in the stove, faint tire tracks from the past few weeks, said the cabin had not been fully abandoned. That night the forest was swallowed in thick darkness, only patches of moonlight slipping through the tall pine canopy, while the breath of every SWAT member rose in thin clouds. At 2:14 a.m., the team began moving in tactical formation, silently climbing the leaf-covered slope to the cabin. One officer whispered, "If he really had an accomplice, that guy could be here too." The SWAT commander tightened his grip on the MP5, eyes scanning the narrow trail where every rustle of leaves could be an ambush. But the cabin was dark. No sound, no movement. It looked empty, until they got close. One detail stopped the entire team cold. Beneath a thin layer of snow near the porch were fresh boot prints, large, deep, heading in. No prints heading out. There was only one possible meaning: Harold Dunley was inside. The breach order came over the radio. In 3/10 seconds, the team took positions around the door. Then the shout "breach," and they kicked the rotten wooden door off its hinges. The cabin exploded with the sound of weapons coming off safe and strobing flashlight beams. What they saw inside made everyone freeze for a split second. Harold Dunley was already sitting in the old chair in the middle of the room, hands resting on his knees, back straight, as if he had known they were coming and had been waiting. No running, no hiding, no resistance. He simply stared straight into the blinding lights with eyes as deep and dark as the waters of Gallatin Canyon. He was much older than his file photos, hair almost completely gray, long beard, gaunt face, yet he sat with a calm that was chilling, as if he had not only known this day would come, but had prepared for it long ago. SWAT screamed, hands up, now." Dunley didn't move. Only after they took one more step did he slowly raise his hands, the motion deliberately slow. In that instant, one officer noticed thin long scars on his wrists, marks that looked like old rope burns from years earlier. Dunley was controlled and cuffed in under 30 seconds. No weapons were found in the cabin except a rusty shotgun, leaning against the wall. Once the cabin was secured, the lead investigator stepped inside and looked at Dunley, forced to his knees on the wooden floor, breathing strangely steady. "Harold Dunley," he said slowly, "you are under arrest in connection with the death of Laura Ellington." Dunley said nothing. He only looked at the floor, lips curling slightly, but not quite into a smile. That silence unsettled everyone in the cabin more than any fight would have. When they searched the cabin again after Dunley was removed, forensics examined the 1974 Chevy K20, parked beside the shed. Though it had been repainted gray, they used a UV spectral imager and found dozens of tiny spots of original Glacier Blue still hiding along door edges, under hinges, inside light wells, and along the bed rails, 100% identical to the 1984 paint chip from Laura's scene. They measured wheel width and compared current tire tread to the old photographs. The result was not just a match in width and groove depth. The spacing between every single tread block lined up perfectly with the Gallatin Canyon track. The forensic team confirmed on site, "This is the truck from the Laura Ellington case." As the prisoner transport left the cabin, Dunley stared straight toward the forest, not saying a word. He never asked why he was being arrested, never asked what they knew, never asked what would happen next. He only stared toward Gallatin Canyon, as if the memory of that 1984 night was still out there, silent, cold, and had never left him. The investigators watched the taillights of Dunley's transport disappear into the trees, everyone understanding they had caught the first monster in this case. But like the second DNA profile on the bracelet, Dunley's absolute silence was not the silence of an innocent man. It was the silence of someone who knew more than they did, the kind that made the entire team feel another shadow was still waiting to be dragged into the light. That night, in front of the now sealed cabin, one thing had become fact. Harold Dunley was in custody, and his truck matched the Laura Ellington evidence 100%. The wheels of justice had started turning, and this time nothing could stop them. The Gallatin County trial began on the morning of March 14, 2026, almost exactly 42 years after the night Laura Ellington vanished. Outside the courthouse, cold early spring Montana wind swept past long lines of residents waiting to get in, many too young to have lived through 1984, but there for the same reason: they wanted to witness the moment justice was finally placed on the table. Harold Dunley was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, deep-set eyes, gray-white hair, walking slowly but with shoulders still carrying the hardness of a man who had lived decades in the woods. He remained silent, just as he had since his arrest. No reaction, no anger, no denial, as if the trial were merely a required formality he had to attend. But the lead investigator and the prosecution team knew they didn't need a confession. They had a forensic chain stronger than any ever seen in a Montana cold case. When the prosecutor stood to deliver his opening, he spoke no emotion, told no story about Laura, mentioned none of the family's pain. He said only one sentence: "We will show the jury a complete, unbreakable forensic chain." Then he placed 6 large boards on stands, in order: paint, fabric, tire track, DNA, cabin map, timeline. The entire courtroom leaned forward. Board 1. The 1984 Glacier Blue paint chip beside Laura's car. The prosecutor explained how the Helena lab used Raman spectroscopy to identify pigments unique to 1974 Chevy K20S, then projected side-by-side images of original paint found in Dunley's truck crevices. 0 deviation, perfect match. Board 2. The beige ripstop canvas, men's 65 military field jacket fabric. A textile expert was called. Under multispectral imaging, he showed the tear pattern, rip angle, and broken fibers matching the scrap caught on the fence where Laura was dragged in 1984. These 2 pieces, he said, were torn from the same garment. Board 3. The tire track. On screen they rebuilt the 1974 BF Goodrich all-terrain tread, and compared it to Dunley's truck tires. The forensic technician pointed to every detail: 18.2 mm spacing between tread blocks, 9 mm depth. Only this brand, this model, this year had this exact pattern. When he overlaid the Gallatin Canyon track photo with Dunley's tire, the jury sat frozen. It was a perfect fingerprint of the vehicle. Board 4. DNA. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. The prosecutor displayed Dunley's STR chart beside the trace DNA from the inside of Laura's bracelet. The DNA expert explained extraction from 41-year-old metal, allele by allele comparison, and locus by locus match. Then he said the sentence that ended all debate: Harold Dunley had direct physical contact with Laura Ellington's wrist. No one in the courtroom breathed loudly. Dunley stared at the table, unmoved. Board 5. The cabin map. Dunley's hand marked Gallatin Canyon circles in thick red ink, with notes on side roads, wind direction, and hidden entrances. The prosecutor said, "This is not a casual hunter's map. This is the map of someone who knew how to take a victim into the forest and never be found." Photos of the cabin followed: M65 jacket, Glacier Blue paint receipts, tools, beige fabric, and the 1974 Chevy K20. Everything formed one complete crime space. The jury stared at the 6 forensic boards, laid out like a physical timeline of the crime, and that was the final board, timeline. An investigator presented it slowly. 1984. Laura leaves the store 1984. Scarf torn 1984. Car moved to secondary scene 1984. Tire. Track into Gallatin Canyon 1986. Dunley leaves Bozeman 2025. Laura's bones found 2025. Dunley's DNA confirmed 2025. Cabin full of evidence 2025. Truck 100% match to paint and tires. That timeline was not an emotional story, it was an unbreakable chain of forensic cause and effect. When the prosecution rested, the prosecutor looked directly at the jury and said, "Not one link in this chain exists if Harold Dunley did not abduct Laura Ellington." Dunley's defense tried to fight back, but their arguments were so weak, they didn't even slow the trial. They claimed possible DNA cross-contamination. The forensic expert immediately countered that Dunley's DNA was on the concave inner surface, impossible to reach without directly grabbing Laura's wrist. They claimed the cabin could have been used by others. The prosecution showed thick, undisturbed dust and item distribution proving the cabin had been untouched since the 1990s. They pointed to the repainted truck. The paint expert showed original Glacier Blue in inner layers that could not be faked. No argument stood against the chain. On the 6th day of trial, the jury deliberated for only 3 hours. The courtroom was dead silent when the foreperson stood and said clearly, "We find Harold Dunley guilty on all counts." A long exhale spread through the room, not relief, but the feeling that a 41-year loop had finally closed. Dunley showed no reaction, no tears, no anger. He only lifted his head and looked straight at the judge with eyes so empty, they were chilling, as if the verdict merely confirmed what he had known for decades. As the cuffs clicked back on his wrists and deputies led him out, no one in the courtroom felt triumph, only the heavy weight of a truth finally spoken. The man who took Laura into the forest in 1984 had been convicted, but the second DNA profile on the bracelet was still waiting, and justice still had one door left unopened. After Harold Dunley was convicted, and the Gallatin County trial ended, many in town thought the Laura Ellington case had finally reached its conclusion. But in the Helena forensic lab, the DNA experts knew that wasn't true. Dunley's DNA was only half the story. The other half, the foreign male DNA sitting right next to his on the inside of Laura's bracelet, remained a nameless shadow, and no one on the team would accept closing the case, while another man walked free. Because one fact was undeniable: if two male genomes were on that bracelet, then on that winter night in Bozeman in 1984, Laura had fallen into the hands of two men. So who was the other one? Immediately after the trial, the lab uploaded the unknown DNA profile into full genealogical analysis, technology that didn't exist in 1984, but is now the most powerful weapon in cold cases. Using genome-wide SNP testing, they broke the sample into tens of thousands of genetic markers and uploaded it to GEDmatch and other law enforcement databases. The method doesn't look for the person directly, it looks for anyone who shares even a tiny fraction of DNA with the suspect, a distant cousin someone has never met. The servers ran for 19 straight hours. Then, on a windy June morning in 2026, the first hit appeared: a distant relative in Idaho. Not close family, no siblings, no uncles, no father-son, a third cousin level match, sharing roughly 1% DNA, faint, but enough for the algorithm to build a preliminary family tree. That relative lived in a rural town near Salmon, Idaho, right on the Montana border, an isolated Rocky Mountain area where old families have branches stretching across 3 states. That name, though innocent, became the first marker on the journey to find the second suspect. When the lead investigator stared at the growing family tree on the screen, he understood they were about to walk a much longer road than with Dunley. The second suspect was not from Bozeman, not in Montana records, and most likely came from a branch that had left the state in the 1960s or 1970s. That also fit a chilling possibility. The second man could have been an outsider. No one in town ever noticed, ever suspected, or even knew he was in Bozeman in 1984. The genealogy unit began mapping generations from Idaho to Wyoming, Wyoming to Oregon, Oregon back to northern Montana. Data slowly revealed a faint picture: at least 12 men from this lineage lived in the Rockies during the 1980s, and 3 were the right age to be the perpetrator. But the suspect's identity still hadn't surfaced. Only age range, geographic area, and one distant cousin living peacefully in Idaho. In the Gallatin County briefing room, when the genealogy results were presented, no one celebrated. No one said the case was over, because they all understood that catching Harold Dunley did not mean they had caught the other man. The one who stood beside Dunley, who touched Laura's wrist, who helped drag her toward Gallatin Canyon 40 years ago. A young officer looked at the family tree board and said quietly, "If he exists, he's still out there somewhere." No one disagreed. News of the genealogy hit spread through town in days. Bozeman, thinking it had closed the painful 1984 chapter, felt the old darkness return. In coffee shops people whispered about the second man. At the university students asked professors about the Laura case like it was local legend. Older residents remembered the unease of that winter, the feeling something had never been explained, and now they knew they had been right. Because the final truth had emerged: Harold Dunley did not act alone. But the second suspect still had no name, no face, no record, no evidence beyond the genetic molecules left on a young woman's bracelet as she was taken into the darkness in 1984. And that was why the story could not end. Bozeman understood that even though justice had seized half the truth, the other half, more dangerous, was still hiding somewhere in the vast Rockies, maybe in Idaho, maybe Wyoming, maybe still in Montana. A man no one knew had been present the night Laura vanished. And so the Laura Ellington case, thought to be closed, had only just opened its final chapter: the hunt for the second suspect. One remaining shadow from 1984, one name not yet spoken, one question still hanging over Bozeman for 3 generations. If his DNA is still on Laura's bracelet, where is he? For more than 40 years, the Laura Ellington case has given America a profound lesson in perseverance, scientific progress, and community responsibility. In 1984, when Laura disappeared on a snowy Bozeman street, police were crippled by the technology of the era: no trace DNA analysis, no way to read a beige fabric scrap on a fence, no way to reconstruct Glacier Blue paint or an off-road tire track. Real evidence: the dropped scarf, the scuff marks in the snow, the B.F. Goodrich tread, was silent for decades. But this case reminds us, justice does not disappear. It simply waits until we are able to see it. Today, every American community faces similar challenges: unsolved disappearances, innocent victims waiting for answers, families unable to let go without the truth. The fact that Harold Dunley's DNA was found on the inside of Laura's bracelet after 41 years shows that even the smallest detail is worth preserving. That bracelet became a symbol of persistence, from the road crew that accidentally uncovered bones in 2025, to the lab that decoded 2 male genomes, to the map in the cabin. Every piece reminds us that truth can be buried, but never erased. The lesson for modern America is this: invest in forensic science, support cold case units, and believe that truth, like Laura's bracelet, always finds its way back to the light. Justice takes time, but justice remembers. Thank you for following the Bozeman 1984 story. If you'd like to keep walking with us on journeys to recover justice like this one, please subscribe so you never miss a single story. See you in the next video, where we'll continue uncovering mysteries that time once tried to hide.